Britain we have three species of newt. The largest one, the great crested newt, it happens to be the rarest one. Very large, rough-skinned newt with a bright yellow belly, and the markings on the belly are very much like fingerprints. You can tell your individual newt from each other just by turning them over and looking at their underside. The most common newt is a smooth or common newt. It's found all over the UK, right up into Scotland. And the third species is common but only in certain areas. It's called a palmate newt. And that's distinguished because the male in the breeding season has a long filament that comes out the end of its tail that it waves in front of the female in order to try and attract her. They're found mainly in moorland air. They're like sort of acid ponds and soil. So it's not a species that you'll find all over the UK. Of all the three species of British newt, the great crested is the biggest. Gets its name from the fact the male has an enormous crest in the breeding season that develops all the way down its back along the top of its tail. It has also got a bright white stripe either side of his tail in the breeding season. The female is black all over her back and yellow on her underside, and is often larger than the male. She's often full of eggs, so she has to be a lot bigger to lay more eggs. The smooth newt, or the common newt it's sometimes called, that also has a crest, and it's often confused for great crested newts. A lot of people say, oh, I've got crested newts in my pond, when what they're looking at is a male smooth newt, which also develops a crest along his back and either side of his tail, but often he is a paler colour with black spots, quite distinctive, and a smooth skin, hence its other name of smooth newt. The palmate newt is often plain brown, especially outside the breeding season. It's very hard to tell a female palmate newt from a female smooth newt, but the males differ because the male palmate newt doesn't develop a big crest. He develops big black hind feet, and he also uses these as well as tail filament to attract a female. The main reason why British and most European amphibians hibernate is that in the winter it's far too cold for their food items, the prey that they feed on, the small insects, the worms, the crustaceans. They disappear. They either die off or burrow down themselves to the winter. So there's no food available. So the most sensible thing is in very cold weather, these animals do either burrow underground in rodent burrows, or they hide under logs or other debris, leaf litter, etc., and they'll spend the winter curled up and are not active at all. But it's not a really deep hibernation, because if you get a very mild winter, for instance, you can actually get newts appearing in ponds in January, and certainly by February they've entered the water. So if it's a good winter, they're more active earlier in the year. It benefits them in two ways. A, because they would starve to death if they were active through the winter, but also their body is attuned to the seasons. And if you keep British newts in captivity all year round and they don't hibernate, their body doesn't get the right triggers, and so they won't breed the following year, or they might try and breed but they'll be sterile. All their sexual organs have to go through this quiet period of a few months in order for them to be ready for the following spring. Hibernation in these amphibians lasts normally from end of November through to the end of February. That's a classic British winter, but it can happen later or earlier depending on the weather. Main threats are, well, a lot of newts live on what we call wasteland, areas of countryside mixed with a few ponds and a bit of shrubbery, vegetation, the sort of places that many developers regard as prime building plots for houses. And of course, if they have great crested newts on those plots, they are a protected species, so they have to go through a whole process of fencing off the pond at certain times of the year, catching all the newts, the crested newts, and of course the other amphibians that come and go as well, and relocating them. And often this proves too expensive for a developer to do, but more and more land is needed for building, so it's becoming more and more usual for this process to happen, and relocating the newts is necessary. So loss of habitat really is the biggest threat to them. Have a garden pond is the best way to protect these newts. If you build your own garden pond, no matter how small, often you will find that it is colonised quite quickly by one or even all three species of British newt. It's surprising when you're in an area with gardens how common newts are in your neighbours' gardens, and if they've got a garden pond they'll quickly end up in your garden pond, and that goes for frogs and toads as well. The important thing is, if you do build yourself a pond, make sure it doesn't have square sides, it's got nice banks that the animals can get in and out of, and don't put fish in your pond. Fish and amphibians don't mix. So a nice natural pond for the insects, the newts, nice plants growing around it, that's the best way to preserve this animal in urban areas. The future should be okay. The fact that great crested newts are protected also inadvertently protects the other species because they share the habitat with them, which is a good thing. And provided that builders and developers, follow the law and do what they should do and relocate the newts, then I think the future is quite rosy. There is one other threat, unfortunately, that's on the horizon. There is a very dangerous fungus that's been discovered in Europe, which we think came from Asian species of newts. We're not sure, but that's a likely source. And it is devastating populations of both newts and salamanders in many areas. Not all areas, but it's possible that if this gets to our shores and gets into the wild populations, then things like the great crested newt could die out in certain areas because of this fungus disease.